I'd like to present Jürgen Nuffer. Jürgen represents Fraunhofer, yeah? The LBF Institute. He's group leader for reliability and safety of active systems, and not director. You are in the Department for Structure Dynamic and Vibration Technique. There is a really interesting. Where is it? There. Yeah, exactly. There's a really interesting exponent from the LBF there to see. And what is really important for us, Jürgen is the leader of part project 4, which is more or less the core of the verification validation. So you got a leader, stage is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Roland, for your kind introduction, and welcome to you all to my talk, which is entitled Design and Test Planning. And let's go directly into this well-known picture you all have seen several times, I think, during the day. And I want to make clear what is the scope of this talk, what is the framework of this talk, and how is what I will talk about allocated within this framework. As you see, I'm talking about the test planning, which will be the core part of my talk, but also on the part of the functional architecture and the design. And it is again important to highlight where these artifacts are located within this framework, saying that we are still located on the engineering layer, consisting mainly of the controlled scenarios, what we have heard several times also this day. And what is important here is that we actually, with these two main artifacts, test planning and functional architecture and design, we are at the transition between the capability layer and the engineering layer, making what we are talking about more concrete and making the transition between the capabilities on one hand, which are more or less on the abstract capability layer, but also the transition, as I will show, between the V&V concept, Roland was already talking about, to the test planning. So my talk will mainly elucidate what is behind these arrows, pointing from the above down to the functional architecture or down to the test planning, and also the interaction between the functional architecture and the test planning as well. And of course, the main output from the test planning, handing over to the test orchestration, making the test, setting the frame for the tests in a more concrete way. So now I zoom a bit into the assurance framework, just highlighting now the test planning and the functional architecture. And the test planning has the main function of the setting of all functional test cases during this design process. And here in this project, we define the test planning such that we are on a functional level, and this means that we as a main output, create the functional test specification. So it's not a test specification which is directly resulting into concrete tests on the physical layer, but still in the engineering layer on the functional behavior of the entire system. So these functional test specifications represent the functional test space as a whole. And this is important for the understanding of the location of what I show you during the next slides. Now let's have a closer look on the test planning. You see this imaginary magnification glass here, and this now zooms into the test planning. And I want to talk about now during the next slides what you actually see here. What are the different interconnections between the artifacts within the test planning? How are the interconnections? And how do they lead to the main outcome, the functional test specification? Later on, you're also invited to come to the booth 13, where the entire row of posters will describe the V&V domain, and especially here, the test specification will be highlighted in the poster 13.4. Okay, what do we see here? I will start with the main inputs coming into the test planning, which are highlighted here. Now we see the test goals and the evaluated scenarios and the functional design. The functional design I will spare out for a moment because this will be highlighted later on much more in detail. But now the test goals, for example. These are the goals that are considering the stakeholder requirements, for example, coming from the capability layer, as we remember from the previous pictures. In our case, in VVM, where we are dealing with the user safety or with the safety issues by itself, it is important that here these goals, these safety goals will be the main, let's say, the main target to be met with our ADS system. The evaluated scenarios, we had a talk by Helmut Schittenhelm this day already, and you can also follow this in the poster 3.1, where it is highlighted in more detail. But the important thing is here, as I mentioned, that we are still in the range of the controlled scenarios, that we have evaluated scenarios coming as an input into the test planning. And there are two visions. The first one is, as we have heard this morning already, that the ODD is covered representatively. That means that not all scenarios are incorporated here and lay the ground for the testing, but that we have represented evaluated scenarios that fulfill this vision. The other one is that these scenario instances are formed statistically, meaning that we have probabilities of occurrence that make it plausible that these scenarios will sketch the entire ODD such that this parameter space that is set here lays the ground for a sensible testing and the test planning. Now, there are several sets of prioritization. For example, this one here. The prioritization occurs at several spots within the test planning, for example here, also on the scenarios and also in the region of the test goals. And only this prioritization enables us to finally reduce the test space at the very end. And these prioritizations, for example here, of the function mainly comes from the risk model, because the risk model, as you may remember from the anti-assurance framework, breaks down the safety goals, for example, and these safety measures must somehow be budgeted down to the different functional design elements. So if we have a functional architecture, then we must ensure that the entire budgeting of the risk must not exceed a certain value, and therefore certain functionalities are prioritized within this framework and others are not so important and can be prioritized down to a lower level. So this is one of the main instances where we can make this kind of a prioritization, enabling us to lower down the overall amount of test space and reduce it to an acceptable amount. Another very important aspect are the so-called concerns. We have heard about this also this day already at some times. And in these posters, which I described here, this topic is also highlighted in a more detailed explanation. But in the core, these concerns are very important because they must be located here in the functional test planning, because they can have a huge influence on the test planning at the very end, because these concerns can constitute at any time during the development process, and they have to be collected, they have to be documented, and they have to be brought about and analyzed in terms of the functional test planning, because any kind of these concerns may lead to the fact that there must be a change, maybe within the design. And so insofar, or in the testing, and insofar it's very important to document this, and they, above all that, have a legal relevance. For example, the so-called probabilistic FMEA and component fault tree analysis is such an example. If we perform a safety analysis, and this can be tools that can be used for that. So this might be ways how these scenario and functional concerns come into play and will play their role within the test planning. We have been also talking about the V&V concept and the structuring of the overall V&V space. And from there, also some demands will come into the test planning. Here, the V&V concept addresses a strategic requirement to the test planning. What does that mean? One example for this kind of a strategic requirement could be that we should take care or must take care of the so-called unknowns. That means artifacts and requirements we don't know yet, but will occur during the testing process, especially during the validation part of the testing process. And here, insofar, this is a very sharp sword, to put it this way, because this can steer the entire direction of the test planning such that the weighing between the verification and the validation is set into track here and demands how these two parts will interact with each other. I will describe this later on a bit more in detail, what that finally means. So, with this said, I now come to the other part, main part of my talk, dealing with the functional design, meaning the functional architecture, and what does this really mean, what is hidden behind that, and why is this such a crucial part of inputs into the test planning. Again, just to remind you that we are still located here on the engineering layer, that we are now talking about this main input here, located here, receiving information here from the capabilities and transform it into a functional design. Again, our famous magnification glass here on the left-hand side. And now you see what is behind that. You can also see this in the poster 11.2. You are invited to look there for more details. There are all in all 4 posters describing this, so I cannot go into all the details here. But what you finally see here in this red box, I will talk about this now, is we have several needs. For example, we have the stakeholder needs that are collected from various sources and that are important in order to derive the system requirements. Also, we have safety goals, which I've been talking about some minutes ago. And these are the top-level safety requirements as a result of the hazard analysis, which come into play here. And now on the right-hand side, we have the so-called behavioral requirements that specify these stakeholder needs. And we have behavioral safety requirements that specify the safety goals on the left-hand side. And these are the main ingredients in order to combine them to system requirements, which are then, in turn, the main prerequisite for the functional architecture. So in the next step, in order to do so, we have to derive concrete quality criteria that precise the so-called functional requirements, which are more or less semantic requirements, which are formulated in a special semantics. But the performance requirements are concrete values behind them, which are really measurable criteria. And here we have a small excerpt of this kind of a requirements list. Again, you can find it in more detail in the booth. And if we have all these ingredients, then it is possible now to derive the so-called functional architecture, which mirrors and represent all these parts which I have described before, and which make it necessary to now again on the functional level, we are still on the functional level, describing the sensing, the planning, and the acting as the main functional building blocks, and all these intermediate parts here, and also the binding elements between these architecture parts. And this is now the first step for an iteration process going on during the development, saying that we have to somehow adjust this functional architecture during the development process to the actual needs coming from the other stakeholder I described in the previous picture. So this is, let's say, the main part, the main input and interaction part between the architecture and the functional design, and both together represent the functional level of system design and of test planning. Just to see it again, now we have all the different ingredients together, and by now initiating the prioritization process I described on the different levels, we can now make a selection and combination, and by doing so, the main output will be the functional test specification, which is the main outcome here. And now I have 2 more slides showing on one hand the functional test specification, and here we call it, it's just an example, but we call it the verification part. I've been talking about the distinguish between verification and validation some slides before. And here again we specify the test object, the environment, and the objectives of the test, but in a functional description. It's still not a technical description, it's based on the functions. On the right-hand side, it's just a screenshot of how we managed all these data. I cannot display everything here because it's not readable anymore, but here, this is let's say, the character of this kind of test specification. In a similar way, for the validation part, we also set up this kind of a test specification, but you see one of the main differences here is that if we limit this down to the safety scope, what we are doing in the project VVM, then here the so-called stakeholder concerns are the main criteria for the validation, meaning that we are on the vehicle level, on the functional level, and we are interested in how far is the entire system capable of the stakeholder concerns that we have written down before. So I'm almost at the end of my talk. I just want to summarize such that I say, we have been talking about this part of the assurance framework on the engineering layer. We have used the system design on a functional level, as well as the test planning together in order to create now an input for the test orchestration, which will be part of the next talk by my colleague Martin Dörr. And we have 2 main branches of output into there. The first one is the functional test specification related to verification, and the other one is the functional test specification for validation. So, with this said, I would like to thank you. I hope that I could elucidate a bit this special part of the assurance framework, and would like to say thank you to you. But I would not like to mention that, of course, I have not done this work alone. There was a team, Björn Filzek, Martin May, and Martin Dörr, representative for the others which have also contributed, but this was, I would say, the main team. Thanks for the good work, and thank you all for listening. Thanks.